Thank you very much, Andrea, and also a warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today. Thank you for making it to this timely discussion we're having today. We're discussing opportunities to advance the anti-corruption agenda through the upcoming 10th session of the Conference of the States Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, short the UNCAC COSP. The UNCAC is the only comprehensive binding anti-corruption agreement, and it has now almost universal coverage, with 190 states parties having joined the convention. The UNCAC celebrates the 20th anniversary of its adoption at the end of this month, and the UNCAC has become and remains the key framework for the global fight against corruption, covering preventive measures to address corruption, the criminalization of corruption offenses, international cooperation, the recovery and return of proceeds of corruption, as well as technical assistance. And the 10th session of the UNCAC Conference of the States Parties, which takes place every 2 years, is now less than 2 months away. It will take place in mid-December in Atlanta in the United States. And there, the United States will take over the chair role for the UNCAC COSP for the next 2 years. So this provides us with an excellent moment to raise awareness of and discuss how to advance the anti-corruption measures globally. And that's what we want to explore at today's event. What can be done at the COSP 10 and beyond under the leadership of the US government and as the US COSP President of the United States to advance the global anti-corruption agenda. The US government is highlighting and has highlighted the crucial role of all non-governmental stakeholders, the private sector, academia, the media, and in particular civil society, in anti-corruption efforts as an important theme of the COSP 10. So in today's event in particular, we will focus on how to leverage the COSP to strengthen efforts to defend, protect, and promote civil society engagement in anti-corruption at country level and global level, including to advance UNCAC implementation. And we will also look at one particular policy issue, namely the transparency of beneficial owners of legal entities. That is one of several important policy issues where we hope to see progress at the COSP in December. Before we hear from our expert speakers, I would like to give the floor to the United States Ambassador to the United Nations in Vienna, Ambassador Laura Holgate, for opening remarks. Ambassador, please.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this discussion ahead of the US-hosted Conference of the States Parties of the UN Convention Against Corruption to be held this December in Atlanta. I welcome the ABA and UNCAC Coalition's collaboration with the US government to host this discussion today. We all know that corruption undermines stable, secure, and functioning societies. It has a devastating effect on individual lives, it weakens democratic institutions, and it degrades the rule of law, perpetuates violent conflict, undermines markets, and continues to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and economy of our countries. President Biden has said strengthening the resilience of rights-respecting democracies in undermining democracy and the legitimacy of democratic governance, committing to lead by example and to work in partnership with allies, civil society, and the private sector. This is reflected in the first ever US strategy on countering corruption, adopted just about 2 years ago. The strategy reinforces the importance of coordinating with stakeholders and promoting the ability of civil society, media, and the private sector to prevent corruption and to push for accountability. We know we cannot do this alone, and one key pillar of this strategy centers on preserving and strengthening the multilateral anti-corruption Anti-Corruption Architecture, a cornerstone of which is the UN Convention Against Corruption. Atlanta is the 10th UNCAC conference, and it provides an opportunity to reflect on progress made as we reach the 20th anniversary of the UN General Assembly's adoption of the treaty. The meeting also represents a chance for the United States and our governmental and non-governmental partners to chart the course for the next 20 years. For the December conference, the United States will sponsor the Atlanta Declaration to highlight the conference's commitment to accountability. First and foremost, UNCAC is a promise by governments to be accountable to their citizens, to take action to prevent and combat corruption. The Atlanta Declaration will remind states parties that they are accountable to the convention itself through full implementation of their obligations as signatories. Those obligations commit parties to hold corrupt actors accountable for their crimes by criminalizing corruption, by adopting enforcement mechanisms with appropriate penalties and sanctions, and by establishing and maintaining institutions with the necessary independence to hold corrupt actors responsible. The declaration will call for accountability for corrupt actors by calling on countries to strengthen the capacity of law enforcement and the judiciary to investigate and prosecute corruption-related offenses, and to deny safe haven for the corrupt and the proceeds of their crimes. Finally, the declaration will call for states parties to become more accountable to each other by supporting mechanisms for international cooperation to fight corruption and, when possible, providing for capacity building and peer-to-peer learning. The efforts of our partners in civil society, such as the UNCAC Coalition, the Funde El Salvador, Open Ownership, and the International Center for Nonprofit Law, representatives of which are joining us today. One of the strongest, most reliable tools for countering corruption lies in civil society engagement. We rely on the deep expertise that can be found within civil society organizations to inform our policies and to inform our citizens. Civil society groups raise awareness of corruption and aid in its prevention. And civil society, along with academia and the private sector, play a pivotal role in exerting pressure on governments to address corruption and hold bad actors accountable. Unfortunately, as we all know, civil society groups and NGOs are often undermined by authoritarian governments for the work they do in highlighting and countering corruption, and they can be targeted precisely for their efforts to demand transparency, fairness, and accountability. Despite the associated risks, we have seen countless civil society groups act fearlessly to call out corruption and bolster government commitments to fight corruption. We have begun to recognize at least some of them through the Secretary of State's Anti-Corruption Champions Awards, which we launched 2 years ago. The convention recognizes the importance of civil society and the fight against corruption, but civil society has not always been sufficiently integrated into the work of UNCAC states parties and their meetings, such as the COSP. That's why we will host a signature event the day before the COSP, which we will call the Civil Society Forum. And to help move the needle on greater civil society involvement at the multilateral level, one of the issues we will discuss in the forum is promoting NGO engagement in multilateral bodies. I hope we will see many of you in Atlanta and at the Civil Society Forum. But as a down payment for now, I look forward to hearing from our panelists as they delve into the discussion of opportunities to advance the anti-corruption agenda at the upcoming conference.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those opening remarks and for highlighting the important role that civil society plays and how the US engages with civil society and some of the positions and plans of the United States government in this regard. I would now like to move to our expert speakers and introduce them to you. We will first hear from Tom Townsend. He is the Executive Director of Open Ownership, which supports more than 30 governments in implementing effective beneficial ownership reform. Tom is an expert on open data, and he was previously head of data policy for the UK government. We will also hear from Jessica Estrada, who is the Transparency Area Director at the National Foundation for Development, Funde, the Transparency International chapter in El Salvador. She is an economist with a degree in project management and is specialized in training, has specialized training in transparency and integrity, anti-corruption, and public policies, among other. And we will hear from Nicholas Miller, who is a senior legal advisor and coordinator for multilateral engagement at the International Center for Non-Profit Law at their global program. He currently leads ICNL's engagement with a variety of international institutions, including the UN Human Rights Council, the Financial Action Task Force, and the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, where he works with governments and civil society to promote freedoms of association, expression, and assembly. And prior to joining ICNL, Nicholas served at the US State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Thank you to the three panelists for taking the time and sharing your expertise and experiences with us today. Tom, I would like to start with you. We're hoping to see progress on beneficial ownership transparency coming out of the COSP 10. Could you please tell us about why beneficial ownership transparency plays an important role in tackling corruption and stemming illicit financial flows, including corruption linked to various crimes, human trafficking, tax evasion, environmental crimes, just to name some of them? Tom.
Thanks, Matthias. Thank you to the UNCAC Coalition and the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative for bringing us together this afternoon here in London, and whatever time of day it is for you. Open Ownership, if you're not familiar, is an organization, as Matthias says, that works with more than 30 governments to actually deliver reform around beneficial ownership. And I suspect, having looked through some of the names in the participant list, most people here know what we're talking about when we mean beneficial ownership, transparency, and reform. But for those that don't, this is about making sure that in every jurisdiction around the world, it is mandatory for businesses to disclose the real people who ultimately control companies, not just those perhaps that are named as the legal owners, perhaps a director, for example. Why that matters is that companies, entities of lots of different types, are typically what is used in most corruption cases and most corrupt efforts around stealing money, committing environmental crime and human trafficking. A business typically is used as part of that because it's an easy way in many jurisdictions still to conceal money and where it goes and who's ultimately in control of it. So making sure that we have a global system of interoperable information about who owns companies across the very widest range of countries possible is absolutely essential, because whether you're looking to do proactive risk assessment of companies within your jurisdiction, red flagging, and also to provide some kind of deterrent effect for using businesses in corruption, or looking to do reactive investigation, the absolute starting point for any of those things is to know who is involved with the business that you are looking at or investigating. So we have to move forward on this issue of beneficial ownership transparency in order to properly tackle so many of the other issues that we addressed through the convention, and many of which Matthias mentioned. It's probably worth just saying where we are today and where we should be aiming for at the next Conference of States Parties in something like 7.5 weeks, if I calculated that correctly. We currently have 63 jurisdictions with some kind of centralized register, some public, some private, some only accessible to other parts of government, some accessible to all. So 63 jurisdictions with a live register with a varying quality, with varying definitions at different thresholds of disclosure and so forth. We have 18 jurisdictions beyond that who are currently implementing this kind of reform, and that includes the United States, who is due to launch their very private federal register of beneficial ownership on the 1st of January 2024. And then a further 51 countries that have something planned, some kind of public commitment made to doing this. So that gives us a total of somewhere in sort of the range of 130 countries either having done something, planning something, or currently implementing something that will be delivered soon. So that is good progress, but that leaves us with a number of other jurisdictions that have done nothing, and a hugely variable range of quality and data use in those countries where delivery has already happened and the register is in place. So what we need to see, I think, at this next Conference of States Parties is clear language in resolutions that pushes governments towards really making use of the asset where they have it, where there is a register in place that data is being used across government to meaningfully tackle corruption. And it's worth recalling that it wasn't until the last resolution on beneficial ownership, Resolution 9/7 at the last Conference of States Parties, that really anybody anywhere started to talk in international fora, at least, about actually using data. So we talk a lot about the reform itself, and we talk a lot about the necessary legal framework needing to be in place, but we very rarely talk about whether or not any of that's used for the ends that it was designed. So we have taken a step forward in 2021 in Sharm el-Sheikh to be pushing this issue of data use, but we need to go much further on that and really make sure that departments across government, tax authorities in particular, start to really use this data where it's available, and where it's not yet available, that those other parts of government who are going to be these end users are properly involved in the process of designing and delivering the system that they should be benefiting from. Quite often in our work, we see many governments designing these tools in isolation, which means they don't necessarily work as planned when they're finally launched. So we need to see more effective delivery to make sure that we're getting the best from the reform and making the most use of all of the efforts that we have all put into pushing this agenda over the years. And I end with a final point about one of the really important things I think we need to see coming out of Atlanta, and that's a really, really strong focus on the interoperability of this data and information. This can sound like a sort of dry and technical area about data and how it's structured, but if we don't do this work now, we are going to end up with hundreds of silos, jurisdictions that can't talk to each other. We know corruption is a transnational crime. We need a transnational data solution, and making sure that we start with that and make sure that what we talk about in Atlanta pushes us in the direction of travel to achieve that is going to be absolutely essential to realize the vision that we all have. I think I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Matthias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that very comprehensive and useful overview on beneficial ownership transparency and what is happening there and what we would like to see. Jessica, I would now like to turn to you. So beneficial ownership transparency is one of the important topics that civil society pushes for on the global level in many countries as well on the ground. You as a transparency activist, as an anti-corruption activist, can you tell us please about your experiences on the ground in El Salvador? What are the challenges and some of the risks that Funde, you, your colleagues are facing on the ground when you try to advance integrity, accountability, transparency, and combat corruption? Because I think as Tom has already hinted, if a government acts in isolation without coordinating with other states, but also without other stakeholders, the results we're getting are not ideal. So Jessica, please give us a sense of what are the challenges, what's the environment that you operate in?
Thank you so much, Matthias, and hello everyone joining the session. I am really honored to be part of this panel and share our anti-corruption experience in El Salvador. It's a difficult context. We don't even have opportunity to talk about beneficial ownership transparency, for example, but there are some other topics that I can tell you about. I am sure we all know that fighting corruption is a challenge itself. I mean, the work usually civil society does promoting anti-corruption actions is uncomfortable for those in power. And that challenge is bigger depending on the context you have, since it is more difficult to fight corruption in countries without checks and balances or without citizens interested and concerned about transparency and accountability, or places where those who demand to combat corruption are constantly spied on and threatened, for example. In El Salvador, unfortunately, we have a combination of all that and even more, starting with our authoritarian government right now. About 5 years ago, we were happy on some improvements in transparency and fight against corruption. Most of those improvements were based on better informed and more demanding citizens, but also on some national oversight bodies implementing actions to face corruption practices. We knew all those improvements were fragile. What we did not know was how easily and quickly they could fall apart. Considering our context, there are many challenges and risks, going back to your question, that we are facing right now to combat corruption in El Salvador. And regarding the challenges, I can highlight, for example, the restrictions we have to access public information and therefore to have evidence that allows documenting or investigating corruption cases. Also, the absence of local bodies to which we can go to report corruption or to request protection for victims or whistleblowers, which also represents a great risk. In this era of misinformation and fake news, I have to say that a very important challenge is to confront the ability that governments like ours have to sell a successful fight against corruption when they are just doing nothing about it. I mean, we have a government that is restricting access to information, limiting citizen participation, and does not have any accountability mechanism. A government that is expelling the Anti-Corruption Commission they installed as soon as it began to identify corruption cases in the current government. And a government that is ignoring international sanctions applied to current public officials for eroding democracy and violating human rights. I mean, there are a lot of things that they are doing that is showing anti-corruption efforts are not a real priority. And regarding risks, I want to mention the permanent risk of being spied on by state intelligence, because they have used this Pegasus software against journalists and members of civil society. And also, I have to mention the approval of new laws and regulations that directly affect the work that civil society is doing, especially for topics like defending human rights or fighting corruptions. And of course, it affects the people who benefit from the work civil society does. This has already caused some organizations and independent media to operate from outside the country. And another huge risk that we are living right now is being on a permanent state of exception. Maybe most of you already know about that. This is facilitating arbitrary detentions or arrests and becomes a threat even for civil society members in a country where due process and judicial independence no longer exist. To close this intervention, because I know we can continue talking about other topics, I believe the main thing that other governments and other actors and we all here can do to support anti-corruption efforts like the ones we are trying to push here in El Salvador and other countries with similar contexts is raise awareness strongly about the importance and the benefits, of course, of complying with commitments like the ones established in conventions, such as the UNCAC, but also strongly condemn what happens in countries like El Salvador, because this should not become a model for anyone to imitate. So there are a lot of challenges, a lot of risks, and a lot to do, but we are trying to do it.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing about the really challenging environment that you and your colleagues are operating it and how you can bravely navigate all these challenges. Nicholas, I would like to turn over to you. The challenges in El Salvador, I believe, are not unique, even though they're very grave. But could you please provide us an overview of civic space trends that you see across the globe right now? What are some of the challenges, risks, and restrictions that civil society organizations working on anti-corruption encounter at the national level that you have seen?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, both to UNCAC and APROE, for elevating this theme of civil society participation and the closing of civic space as a risk factor for effective anti-corruption. It's a hard act to follow, speaking after Jessica, and in some ways I almost feel I could use the time best by ceding it to her to give more detail about El Salvador, because unfortunately many of the examples she gave from El Salvador are emblematic of the trends that we're seeing internationally. That said, let me try to extract some general trends that we are seeing to give our conversation more focus. I'll start though by saying I think it's important always to do this, and I'm echoing the ambassador in this, that as we talk about negative trends in civic space, because unfortunately the trends that I will lay out for you are all negative, it is important to keep in mind that civil society around the world continues to function, continues to, as the ambassador said, fearlessly work for causes such as the fight against corruption, but also the preservation of democracy and rights in general, development, and many other issues of common cause. ICNL, the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, focuses on the legal enabling environment for civil society, by which we mean the laws and policies that create the space in which civil society can organize and operate. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the laws and legal trends we see, but that, in our view, fundamentally is linked to the reality experienced by civil society on the ground. So I'm also going to talk a bit about the extra legal trends that we see. First, on the legal front, we do make an effort to track laws and policies adopted in different countries. And on rough count, over the last 5 years, we've seen, at a minimum, 288 initiatives adopted by states that affect civic space. And these are both laws and policy changes. We limit this to measures that directly affect expression, association, and assembly. So that's a pretty significant limitation. But still, the number 288 in our view is high, because these measures are universal and so affect the entirety of the nonprofit sector. Of those measures, 83% are restrictive. Think about what that means. That's over 200 laws and policies adopted at the national level to restrict civic space. What do we see as we begin to unpack this? What kinds of restrictions are there? I'm going to name a few. I'm going to add a few spontaneously to my list based on what I heard Jessica saying, because I really do think it's profoundly important to wrestle with some of the challenges being faced in El Salvador, especially since they are not unique. One, and increasingly common, is the elevation or imposition of barriers to access to funding, and in particular foreign funding. This is not a new trend, but we've seen an increasing number of outright bans and innovation on the part of authoritarian and unfortunately non-authoritarian states in limiting access to funding by imposition of onerous reporting requirements, or, as mentioned extra legally, direct repression or attack on organizations for receipt of international funding. This is especially important to think about in the context of developing countries, where there often isn't a robust domestic funding ecosystem. And that's particularly true for organizations working on issues like anti-corruption, which challenge those in power, or those working on behalf of marginalized communities or for human rights issues. Another trend we're seeing is the expansion of security narratives, national security laws, and counterterrorism laws, here inclusive of anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, and the deployment of these laws against civil society. Now, in its most benign form, and often unintentional, this looks like onerous reporting requirements or overburdensome regulation. But unfortunately, in many cases, it isn't in that most benign form, and it takes the place often of arbitrary cancellation of status or spurious prosecution. And not far from Jessica, you can see a prime example of this in Nicaragua, where in recent years, over half of the nonprofit sector has been completely shuttered using a countering the financing of terrorism law. Just think about that. And that's not a random selection either. Those are the organizations that would do the kind of work that we collectively care about and relate to anti-corruption or human rights. This goes further, won't go into too much detail, but those onerous restrictions and reporting requirements also apply to banks who are not part of this conversation directly, but I've mentioned it because banks too have to react. And often the result is debanking of nonprofit organizations, which is effectively an existential threat to many. An additional trend is stigmatization, and this can include the use of foreign agents laws. So here what we see is governments, either through legal status or through rhetorical attack, casting civil society as the enemies of the state, the enemies of the people, the enemies of development, in ways that impede civil society organizations' ability to raise public awareness, to call into question corrupt action on the part of government. And so this, unfortunately, can also be quite an extreme problem for civil society. And it relates to, I think, what you're seeing, Jessica, in El Salvador, but certainly seeing this in every region of the world. And this is not just an authoritarian action. States as diverse as Australia, Israel, the United States have foreign agents laws. Now, I'm not saying, and I would never say that they are applied in the same way, but it does make it more complicated to push back against these laws. Last category that I'll mention here is what we like to think of as barriers to operation. It's a generic category under which many things that are much more insidious fall. Here we're looking at the arbitrary application of administrative power to civil society organizations. And this can be denial of registration, management burdens. We've even seen some countries, for example, that require civil society organizations to make all of their management meetings open to participation by public officials. And you can imagine how that might intersect with an effort to hold the government accountable for corruption. But here too, and I'm going to put in this barriers to operation category, the increasing prevalence of aggressive surveillance of civil society organizations. Jessica mentioned Pegasus. I put it under barriers of operation, but it could even be broken out as its own category. And lastly, in this category, I'm going to put access to information and transparency, because we've seen, and this was mentioned by Tom and will, I'm sure, come up again, government efforts to foreclose access of civil society to routine information, suspension of FOIA equivalent laws, for example, but also specific to countering corruption, and that's perhaps unsurprising, but it happens in a context in which legal systems and rule of law are weak, and therefore gives civil society few options for appeal. So with that, I'll close. We can talk about any or all of those more in question and answer, but I just like to return to the point that despite all these trends, we're really grateful to the United States, to UNCAC, to ABA ROLI for elevating this issue of civil society participation and anti-corruption. And we think it's important to note that these trends have not stopped civil society from playing the important role it plays, and we don't anticipate they will do so, but they do make it harder and less effective. So we do hope we can collectively find ways to push back against these trends and begin opening civic space instead of closing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for putting this in context and for really highlighting many of the restrictions and types of challenges that governments impose on civil society, and what some of the trends are that you have observed. The second round of questions, Jessica, I think I would like to start with you. Could you maybe give us a sense of, based on your experience, what can governments and other actors do to support civil society in its anti-corruption efforts and to promote accountability? We are here as a really a global community of civil society and also of governments that are trying to advance anti-corruption efforts. Could you give us a sense of what you would like to see governments and other actors do to support organizations and activists like yourself?
Well, I mentioned a few ideas on the previous intervention, but not thinking right now, unfortunately, in my government, but other governments and actors that can help to continue advancing with these topics. But thinking about what we can do, I mean, I was mentioning that it is really, really important. Maybe we have not been as effective as we should, making people understand why it's important to fight corruption, why it's important to complying with commitments like the ones we have in the UNCAC or any other coalition or convention, because in El Salvador, for example, most of the people don't even know about these coalitions, and they believe the government is fighting corruption when they are not doing so. So we are wondering what else can we do to engage people and to engage other actors, and for us, the ones that already know this is important, how can we translate this to others and being effective communicating the importance of this. And that's why I was also mentioning that it's important to condemn and speak up about what is going on in El Salvador. And for example, Nicolas already mentioned Nicaragua. And some people say, okay, Nicaragua, there's nothing to do, so we can forget about what's going on. I mean, we cannot do that. We have to strongly condemn what's going on. We have to defend what we fight for and what we believe in, and why fighting corruption is important to have a more developed country and to have better lives for everybody. I mean, we have not been effective enough trying to communicate this. And other actors, I mean, it's important to maybe duplicate or triplicate the work that we are doing with citizens, because I also mentioned 5 years ago, we were seeing more commitment from citizens requesting information and going to public institutions and reporting corruption, for example, and we don't have that anymore. What happened with all that people? I mean, there's a lot of fear to do this type of work, of course, and we already know that, but sometimes we lose this sense of try to do something because we know it's not effective, and sometimes some people believe it's not worth it. So we have to change that. How to do it is something that we haven't figured out yet, but I know we can get a lot of maybe not answers, but possibilities and ideas from groups like the ones are right now on this conversation.
Thank you, Jessica. Tom, Jessica just highlighted, that we also need to explain what we're fighting against and why we fight against corruption, how we fight against corruption, how we will be able to impact corrupt environments. Tom, could you give us maybe a better sense of what you would ideally hope that governments agree to at the COSP in regards to beneficial ownership transparency? You already hinted at some of the aspects in your first intervention, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. You've also mentioned central registers. Could you maybe explain to the colleagues who may not be experts in that area why what we would like to see in this regard in terms of access to central registers and why that is so important?
Thanks, Matthias. And to start with that first question, what we mean by central register really is that data is available at the heart of government and is available at a minimum to all those departments within government and law enforcement who need to be able to see that information. That's what we mean. It's centralized in that regard. It's not split out across a number of different departments or hard to get at, which is the case in a number of jurisdictions where one department may have to write a handwritten letter in some cases to get information that comes in a PDF. All of the kind of bits of sort of bureaucratic friction that are either designed in a system to frustrate or just exist as a sort of hangover from the way in which things have been done in the past. So that's what we mean by central registers. What we need to see, yes, we need to see more commitment, and we need to see a stronger resolution to give UNODC and all of us who do this work a really strong foundation for pushing forward good delivery. So that should focus on collecting data that's good, that it's verified, that it's structured so it can be used, and that it's made available to everyone that needs it. And ideally, that's publicly available, that anyone can access the data from civil society, journalists, and others to make sure that we can bring many eyes to this. And there's lots of good reasons for making this data public that go way beyond the anti-corruption imperative, not least among which it enables people who are named as beneficial owners to check if they're in that register and that they should or shouldn't be there, as we see in the UK in a situation where there's this information is not verified. Any of you could be named as a beneficial owner of a company in the UK without knowing it, because no one verifies or checks the data. So that information being made public at least gives you some recourse and ability to see if you are named. The UK is kind of an extreme example in that regard. What I would say, though, and to think about, Jessica, what you're talking about and the situation that you and many other civil society organizations face around the world in trying to do this kind of work, tackle corruption, disclosing beneficial ownership information and having a good system of central registration of company ultimate owners is not a silver bullet for tackling corruption. It just isn't. It's not going to be the end result. It's not going to deliver in and of itself the solutions that we want. It is not going to deliver a less aggressive state that seeks to spy on its civil society and shut it down. It's not going to do those things. But it is quite fundamental to everything else we want to achieve. It's a little bit like gravity. You kind of, we would know if we didn't have it. And we know we don't have beneficial ownership information because wherever we look, we are unable to find the ultimate owners of companies, and these getaway vehicles of choice, as shell companies were once called, still exist all over the world, and we have to deal with that. So I want to see more commitment at the next Conference of States Parties. I want to see more commitment from the Financial Action Task Force and more commitment from countries in any other international fora. But fundamentally, what I really want to see is delivery of existing commitments, because if what had already been committed to was delivered effectively, we would be far further ahead than where we are today. So it's a frustrating point to make. It's a common point to make, but commitment really is only the start. We have to see effective delivery of what is being promised in order to realize the benefits that we all see from these reforms. And if we don't do that, I think we run the risk of 10, 15 years down the line of everyone kind of going, well, that's another failed initiative. That's another policy that everyone said was going to solve everything and hasn't, because the delivery was rubbish. So commitment is good. Better resolutions are good. Effective delivery is even better.
Thank you, Tom, for stressing the needs that also governments really implement what they have committed to effectively. Nicholas, from your perspective, what should governments and the US as the host and chair of the COSP be doing to promote safe, active participation of civil society, to defend and protect those who are coming under attack, to create a more enabling, help create a more enabling environment across the globe? Do you have any specific ideas, suggestions, and maybe also specific examples of where this is actively done that you could share with us?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. I really like the framework that Tom has just set out about moving from commitment to implementation to effectiveness, and so I'll present some examples, but I think with each of these examples, I would underline that we need to think about those phases. Just stating them or committing to them is insufficient. That said, and acknowledging with thanks, the United States and the ambassadors' statements about the importance of civil society, open civic space, and in particular civil society in the area of anti-corruption, I would strongly encourage, call upon, implore the state parties in December to ensure that the Atlanta Declaration includes explicit language on civic space protections. It's at the level of commitment, and to the degree there could be more specificity included, that would be wonderful, but that's a starting point. Moving into more specific measures. And again, I'm thinking about Jessica's experience here. There are activities we can undertake, collectively states can undertake, in particular the United States as an outside party, but with friendly interests for many other states, could encourage third-party governments to undertake, as could other governments do. And that includes improving civil society laws. So here we mean the laws governing the nonprofit sector. These look like a lot of different things, Matthias. I'd like to be specific about what this means, but governments regulate the nonprofit sector in radically different ways. So it has to be contextual analysis. But That's a key element without which we won't make progress on civic space. These laws should be reformed in a way that frees organizations from governmental interference that is not risk-based and carefully calibrated to legitimate purpose. We need to make sure that they aren't arbitrary so that people don't face either perceived or real threat of dissolution or sanction. The arbitrariness here is key because often the extra legal component that I discussed earlier comes in where officials, often with little oversight, and in a context where there's no appealability or recourse to rule of law or jurisdiction or legal process, can exercise their authority in ways that are designed to deter civil society's legitimate activities. Then we have to think more broadly, because a lot of laws that affect civil society aren't specifically the regulation of the sector. So we need to look at anti-corruption activists and how they're affected by defamation laws, for example, which, when poorly drafted, can be used as a weapon against critical voice. We need to look, as already stated, at anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism laws. We need to look at tax laws, and the list goes on, because all of these laws can and are used to harass anti-corruption activists. We also need to protect people affirmatively from risks that we know exist. I'll give an example here that I think is very important. I also saw someone mentioned in the chat, whistleblower protection laws, which I would endorse, but there's also the need for anti-SLAPP laws. SLAPPs, for those of you who don't know, is a strategic litigation against public participation. And to not use the jargon, it's basically an offensive lawsuit designed to force a critical voice to silence itself or face crushing legal expenses and process. And there are examples out there of good laws to protect against SLAPP litigation. And then lastly, and perhaps very, very difficult, but critical, we have to think about this all in the context, as others have already mentioned, of the broader rule of law ecosystem. Are the courts up to protecting rights? And that's going to be a long-term effort, but here we get to the implementation challenge that Tom laid out. Now, a few other thoughts. We also need to raise awareness of the within the sector of how they can work around these issues. And for example, right now, we're talking about beneficial ownership, which I think is really great, and concur isn't not sufficient, but absolutely necessary step in countering corruption. But we've seen a lot of confusion around beneficial ownership as applied specifically to the nonprofit sector. And so here, I won't go into great detail here, and Tom would know this better, but what I will say is, to the extent that governments are applying any sort of beneficial ownership directed reforms to the nonprofit sector itself, which often is inapropos, but still can be done, but has to be done in the context of extensive discussion and awareness raising with the nonprofit sector itself. And then lastly, let me end on what I think is a really, really important point. And here, Matthias, I'll try to respond to your request for examples of good practice currently out there. And this has to do with protecting the people who are coming under pressure or even attack, verbal or sometimes physical. And this is depressingly common. So there are some good efforts out there right now. There are efforts at the normative level, and those are important. There are actors like the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders who report on this issue, who go into countries, who assess the extent of it, and I would really commend those efforts. There are multilateral efforts like the Lifeline Embattled CSO Assistance Fund, which if you don't know, you should look up, but it does things to help individuals and organizations immediately under threat, but also to help organizations respond to critical advocacy opportunities of short duration. And then lastly, I think there are civil society organizations themselves that are really doing the brunt of this work that need more support from governments. And I would just name one, which I think is a fantastic organization, Frontline Defenders, that really protects people in critical and even dangerous situations. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to this. One last thing, there is actually need also to protect those who are forced into exile. And within the context of the Summit for Democracies, the Civic Space Cohort, which ICNL chaired with Norway and the Czech Republic, has put out a call for further action on this issue, including some advice for states on what they could do. So I would call that both a best practice, but that's at the level of setting commitments that needs further implementation. I refer that to all of you for your consideration. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. So I would now like to start opening the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, use the symbol to raise your hand. And I would ask you to turn on your camera if possible, and to briefly introduce yourself and to be concise with your question, and to please address the topics that we are discussing today. I will take a few questions and then we go back to the panelists. Musa, please go ahead. Musa, please ask your question, even if your camera is not working. Or if you're not there, then Sayed, please go ahead.
Yes, Matthias, can you hear me, please?
Yes, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to take part to this activity. My name is Jonathan Musa from Democratic Republic of Congo, especially in Kinshasa. So I would like just to highlight one most important thing when we are fighting against corruption in the context of war, like in Democratic Republic of Congo, in a context of post-conflict. And in the context where the framework is a very, very weak. First of all, we don't have the law of access of an information, the protection of a whistleblower, the lack of a special anti-corruption law, the lack of independent anti-corruption authority, and the law of access declaration. We don't have all those. I'm very sorry. We don't have all those framework in Democratic Republic of Congo. In this context, civil society who are working on anti-corruption have a difficult work to do. So it will be very important for me when we are talking about COP10 to focus most on the countries in a context of conflict, because the measures are not the same when we are talking about developed country and developing country. So it was just a remark what I would like to point out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this important highlight. Thank you. Sayed, please. Please go ahead. We cannot hear you, so I would like to go to Melissa Ayton. Please ask your question.
Yeah, I'm Melissa Ayton from the National Endowment for Democracy. We have both a sort of research program on combating kleptocracy, but we also have a grants program to civil society organizations around the world that are working on transnational kleptocracy related issues. I've never been to the COSP before, and I'm trying to sort of figure out if I should go. And I don't know if this is the right forum to ask this, but if someone could sort of run down what to expect, how many civil society representatives are there, just sort of what's it like to be part of it, I think would be really helpful for those of us who have never done it.
Thank you very much. I will try to come back to that in the end. Nancy, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Nancy Saivo. I am the Executive Director of a civil society organization based in Cameroon. I'm honored to be here. I am an anti-corruption activist. I lead the movement Follow the Money in Cameroon. So my question is, I had two questions. I think Melissa asked my first question. Thank you, Melissa. And my second question is, how can civil society work together with the anti-corruption institutions? Because sometimes I feel like the institutions don't care much about what civil societies are doing. I'm not just talking for Cameroon, but I've noticed that with African countries where I've worked with. So we have to start looking for how, I'm just asking, so how can civil society work better together with the anti-corruption institutions in countries that don't have agencies? Because that's where we have to start. Well, if we want our work to go into the grassroots, civil society cannot do the work alone, but the agencies that are in each country can collaborate for a better result. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I will collect maybe two more and then hand it back to the panelists. Duncan, please.
Thank you for those presentations. Duncan Haynes, Transparency International in the UK. We only truly understood the inadequacies of Britain's company beneficial ownership registry because it was public and out in the open. So with regards to wanting truly effective anti-corruption reforms, what should we be asking for of those jurisdictions implementing centralized but nonetheless closed registers, if we in civil society have any confidence that those registers are more capable of helping prevent corruption than the British Register was before we've said about introducing some quality controls over the information in it?
Thank you very much, Duncan. It's a great question. One last one. Apologies if I'm not following the sequence, but Richard Anthony, please go ahead, and then we'll hand back to the speakers. Richard, please ask your question. Then we cannot hear you, so Aya, please go ahead.
Good day.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello.
We can hear you.
Thank you for your presentation.
Hello.
Please go ahead, Aya. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthias. So what I want to ask, the UNCAC coalition, there are many organizations that have subscribed to the movement, and those civil society organizations, especially here in Africa, they are cash-strapped. So what's the strength, the capacity building aspect of civil society groups that UNCAC can support so that they can be a match? Maybe they can be an influencer, or maybe a changer to government. That kind of aspect. That's what I would like to know about UNCAC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. I would like to hand back to the speakers. Maybe you could address some of the issues you feel most comfortable with. Tom, could I start with you?
Yeah, I'll pick up specifically on Duncan's question. I think it's a really, really good one. I mean, sort of pleasingly, I suppose, we'll get an answer at least from one jurisdiction to your question in a couple of years' time, because the GAO in the United States is legally mandated to come back to Congress with a report, I think 18 months or 2 years after the Corporate Transparency Act there is implemented, and tell Congress if it's worked and if it's been effective and useful in supporting law enforcement to tackle financial crime. So we'll have some mechanism by which a closed register, extremely closed register, will be evaluated. Government sort of marking its own homework and coming back with something to a legislature to say if it's been effective or not. I think what it is we should be asking for and looking for with regard to a non-public register to understand and satisfy ourselves that it is working, I think it's a really good question. I don't think we have come to a kind of collective sense of how we would want to see that take place. I think there are lots of kind of ancillary ways in which that could happen that I think are very can be quite lacking in some ways. So I think about some of the international peer review mechanisms. I think about some of the FATF review mechanisms, which are currently very focused on compliance and with the existence of a system and with the existence of an underlying set of legislation which is deemed effective. What they are not necessarily measuring is any of the things that you're pointing towards. Does this actually deliver what we say it does and give us the outcome that we want, which is a materially more hostile environment for corrupt practices to take place? That's all a really long-winded way of saying your question is, I think, the right one. And I don't think that we collectively have come up with a kind of set of metrics that we would like to see measured where this information is not public. The kind of final point on all of this is, many of us here will be aware that the pushback against public has been strong inside of the EU. Court judgment at the back end of last year saying that registers should not be available to everybody. But the journalists and civil society do have a legitimate interest in seeing and using this data. So I think, in my most positive moments, I see that as potentially a way forward to bring countries that were never going to go public, perhaps into a space where there is a more layered type of access in which journalists and civil society do continue to get access, or in cases where a register has been closed, begin to get access. And that might open up more opportunities for non-governmental scrutiny of the efficacy of these reforms. But we still have a long way to go, and we must never lose sight of the fact that the easiest, cheapest, and most effective way of delivering all of the outcomes we want from companies disclosing this information is to make it public. And I'll hand back to you, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Tom. Nicholas, what are your reactions to some of the challenging questions posed by some of the audience members?
Thanks, Matthias. I'm actually going to punt. I think the challenging questions are the right questions, but I don't have the answers for them. I mean, in particular, I think the capacity building question is an excellent one that I'm not the right person to address. I think Duncan's question, Tom fielded well. I think the question about how to work with anti-corruption institutions where either they're lacking, as in Congo, or unwilling or lacking, as in Cameroon. That's a strategic question, but also I think it's one that the international community should be thinking about how it can help with, how it can incentivize and encourage. But I'm not going to posit an answer because I don't think that's my place. But I also, finally, I love Melissa's question. And I will here just put a little 2 cents on the table, which is that I think it's wonderful the US is organizing a civil society day prior to the Conference of State Parties. I do not think that is a best practice. And I think it's a good start. I think civil society needs a space, but absent meaningful inclusion of civil society in the Conference of State Parties itself, and I'd love to hear how that will look, it's insufficient. And we do know how that can be done. We've seen it done well in other contexts, but unfortunately, a separate convening is becoming a bit standard, and it doesn't do what we need it to do. So there are my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Jessica, what are your reactions to the challenging questions posed?
It's that, just reactions. Like Nicholas said, maybe we don't have the answers, but some ideas taking the questions that you made. It's complicated to think that the solution or some solutions can come from new laws or regulations, like someone mentioned there, because I was thinking in El Salvador, we still have one of the best access to information acts, and using this law was possible to initiate judicial proceedings for corruption acts against 3 former presidents. But now is useless. I mean, we cannot even request information. Everything is reserved or classified, or it does not exist. And thinking about one of the main challenges, we had to elaborate the parallel report on the UNCAC. It was precisely that we didn't have enough information to build it. And we had, well, the entire process of preparing this report was really complicated. We even had threats against the people that was making the first analysis directly from government officials. So do you think, I mean, we have an Access to Information Act, we cannot use it. And like we said in El Salvador and other Latin countries, echa la ley, echa la trampa. In English, maybe it's like rules are, or laws are to be broken, something like that, because that's what's happening in our countries, and they don't want to comply with conventions or laws, and it's necessary to think beyond that. And I was checking a lot of good ideas and things that we have to reinforce or strengthen on the chat. It's really, really important to defend and to see how we can improve even in the conditions that we are working right now, and in some countries harder than others. And of course, we are stronger together. We need to build and strengthen national, local coalitions, alliances, and networks dedicated to defend democracy, to combat corruption, to protect civic space, and share the information we have, share what we have learned on the process. And spaces like this and the COSP UNCAC are great places to do that. So just ideas, not answers.
Thank you very much. And if I may use my privileges as the moderator to also try to address some of the points and questions raised. What to do when there are no anti-corruption frameworks in like a post-conflict state, that is very difficult. Our approach is that we think the UNCAC review mechanism needs to be as strong, as transparent, and as inclusive as possible, so that the implementation review hopefully creates momentum for reforms on the national level. And we are really trying hard to get governments to include civil society and other non-governmental stakeholders in that process, in follow-up measures, and to we're trying to nudge them to make these processes not only inclusive but also transparent, so that they publish the full reports that assess their UNCAC implementation, and that they really commit to implementing follow-up action. This will not be feasible in all contexts, and there will be governments that resist to that or don't have the capacity to do that. But I think there are a number of countries where more can be done, and where there might be windows of opportunity to create momentum for reforms by having truly inclusive review processes and follow-up. Another point I wanted to address is the capacity building aspect. I think that is a challenge we know of from many countries, many civil society colleagues. As the UNCAC coalition, we are not affiliated with the United Nations. We're a small umbrella civil society organization with very limited resources. But what we're trying to do is to bring the civil society colleagues together to create space and fora for collaboration, for opportunities to learn from each other's experiences, to network, and to coordinate advocacy. And I think that's one important aspect. How as civil society we can be stronger is if we support each other, if we work together, and if we also give everybody the feeling that they're not lone fighters in their countries, but there is a global community that works to the same goals, that supports them, and that is there for each other. I think that is what we can try, and what we're trying to establish, such a stronger global community. And one aspect that maybe Tom can elaborate a little bit on, one slightly encouraging trend we see is that UNODC, the UN, when delivering technical assistance, brings in civil society expert groups. And hopefully we're trying to push for more non-governmental organizations being brought in donor projects delivered by the United Nations, so that it's not the UN and the country implementing a reform, but it's done in a more inclusive way. That includes all the relevant stakeholders and voices on the national level as well. And maybe a final point on what to expect at the COSP. It's hard to predict, but we know at this point that 400 non-ECOSOC NGOs have registered from around the world, and we expect maybe a couple hundred ECOSOC NGOs. There will be a weekend of activities before the COSP. There will be a civil society forum, an academic forum, a youth forum. We know that for the Civil Society Forum, we have over 600 registrations already. So we expect a very significant turnout from civil society, and I think that is one of the opportunities to use the COSP to build new connections with civil society, but also with government delegations, meaning you have a chance to meet people from leadership from anti-corruption agencies, diplomats working on anti-corruption, but also the UNCAC focal points, different governmental stakeholders that work on anti-corruption. So you possibly can build new connections there. There will be lots of side events where governments and civil society and other stakeholders will discuss key anti-corruption issues. And one important opportunity for advocacy is to work with governments as they negotiate resolutions. We anticipate one resolution that will address beneficial ownership transparency. We hope for other resolutions that focus on issues such as gender and corruption, on public procurement, on possibly whistleblower protection. So there are specific topics where we as civil society on the ground can try to influence and inform governments as they negotiate those resolutions, to try to make sure they are as useful and as meaningful as possible, and that we can move the agenda points from the, as Tom and Nicholas have stressed, from just the commitments of governments to actual implementation and hopefully in an effective way. I just wanted to quickly highlight, we have the UNCAC Coalition COSP 10 webpage where you find recordings of briefings and more information that you may need. And to register for the pre-COSP events, you can go to cosp10.us, which is the US government website, and register there for those events. And the registrations may close soon, so please do this sooner rather than later. Apologies for taking too much time, but I hope I managed to address some of the questions that relate more to our experience as the UNCAC Coalition. We have a few more hands raised, so I would like to have a second round of questions from the floor. I see Emily, and then Tariq, please.
Yes, thank you, Matthias. Hi, I'm Emily Wegener from Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. My question is sort of on top of what Jessica said about a lot of information being withheld now in El Salvador due to classification and so on, which is a problem that in the defense and security sectors, it's very vast. And we wanted to know, you said the resolution on beneficial ownership is being anticipated, and if there's any scope to influence for everything that is mandated in terms of transparency for public sectors, for that also to apply to defense and security sectors, or for exemptions based on national security or in general on grounds of security to be limited and clearly defined. So what just was mentioning, that a lot of information is withheld, and also beneficial ownership information, for example, on the ownership of private military and security companies, doesn't remain hidden from civil society, if there's any scope to influence that, or if that's on the radar too with governments at the moment.
Thank you, Emily. Tariq, please.
Thank you very much for 3 excellent presentations. It's a complex issues, but thank you for the debate. I'm Tariq Khosa, Director, Center for Governance Research. We launched this national initiative against organized crime in Pakistan and are actively associated with the UNTOC review process in our country. But I think the key lesson which UNCAC Coalition or the UNTOC review process is that we need to develop civil society alliances, not only domestically, but regionally and globally. I think while the resolutions will be passed by member states and others, I think it's an important point to have some kind of a civil society declaration, which reflects the concerns which have been raised by the panelists. I would say that Nicholas raised the issues about challenges and risks and restrictions, even surveillance and arbitrary sanctions against civil society. Those are the matters that must be brought to the fore, and we should not shy away from raising those concerns on behalf of the civil society. Jessica has very correctly pointed out what is El Salvador is also relevant in many other countries. And we are looking for a truly independent institution of accountability, and where parliamentary oversight, judicial oversight, or there are sacred cows who are beyond, accountability. So that is also an issue where we would like to see if there are any independent, effective, institutionally effective accountability mechanisms. And I think
apologies if I have to intervene, but we have a few more hands raised and we're soon running out of time.
Okay, so I'd like to look at some of the international best practices through Civil Society Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Emin has his hand raised, please, and then Empower Sankar, and then I'm afraid that's all we have time for.
Hi, thank you so much for picking me. I'm Emin Bayramli, the son of Gubadi Badolu, a London School of Economics professor who has been wrongfully imprisoned in Azerbaijan. And one of the questions I wanted to ask is that one of the things that we have seen is a lot of donations made by countries like Azerbaijan to the Western countries. And I wanted to know what the panelists think and how we could somehow stop it or make it more eligible for other people to see who has gotten a donation or who hasn't, and from what country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So the last question, Empower Sankar.
Yes,
please.
Good evening from India. This is Sankar from Empower India, which is a civil society organization working in the grassroots communities for the past 32 years. Thank you very much for organizing this kind of VC and coordinating, especially thanks to me, Matthias. My thing is, the civil society should be given more importance in the country-wise, because you are conducting so many meetings and you are giving importance. But in the countries, there is no relevance. And especially in India, the corruption, all political parties, they are receiving the donations in the name of electoral funds without any auditing or any, it is not come under the purview of Right to Information Act. This is common for all political parties, not only for ruling party or opposition party. All political parties, they hand in hold in these things. So I request the UNCAC to intervene on these kind of things. And the next time, kindly invite some speakers from India. This is my request. Thank you so much. Very kind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Apologies for all those questions that we couldn't address at this point. I would like to do a very quick round of reactions from the three panelists, and unfortunately then we have to move to closing. But if there are any questions that are of a more technical nature where the UNCAC Coalition can help, please send us a message to cosp10@uncaccoalition.org, and we can get back to you separately. Tom, do you have reactions to the last few interventions?
I'll just stay with the question specifically on the beneficial ownership space and the potential resolution. I mean, there isn't the issues around secrecy relating to the defense and security sector are not really dealt with specifically and don't really come up. That was one of your questions. Is this even sort of coming up? Not really. There are exemptions in most regimes around the world for personal safety, if that can be publicly available information that would clearly damage or potentially harm personal safety, then an exemption can be made from publication. This has come up less in the realm of secrecy around the defense and security sector. Interestingly, whilst after you asked that question, I thought I would go and look up some private military contractors based in the UK and a couple of other countries for which we have data, and sort of look at whether or not they were disclosing their beneficial ownership. And the answer was they were, for the most part, all controlled by holding companies where their ownership had been arranged such that no one individual fell beneath the threshold to disclose. So that's how they were concealing themselves, using the rules very legally in order to conceal that. So that even if you were to sort of focus on that particular issue, where thresholds for disclosure are set at 25%, which has become this kind of de facto international standard, it's pretty easy to structure your business in a way where you don't have to reveal, and that's perfectly okay without ever having to stray into exemptions for the defense sector. So I just wanted to answer that question, and I'll hand back to Matthias.
Thank you very much. Jessica, do you have reactions to those interventions?
Well, my reaction is regarding the information that we can or we can't access here in El Salvador. I was referring to the information requested to elaborate the parallel report, because reserving information, usually it's like that in the laws, should be the exception. And in contexts like ours, it has become the rule. And in many countries, I know, our law establishes a lot of information that must be published actively or proactively without needing to be requested. And even if you ask for that information, many institutions are denying it. And since the entity in charge of reviewing this is also like co-opted, there is no much we can do. We even requested like the emergency plans during COVID, and they didn't want to give that to people. I mean, it's ridiculous. And if you request information about the anti-corruption efforts, everything is reserved, and they say it's for security reasons or security purposes. So we have to push with the access to information laws, because it's important to get that information and the evidence to make proposals, to be informed, to make right decisions. So that's a good point that a lot of people has also lighting today. So
thank you very much, Jessica. Nicholas, before I hand over to you for final comments, we would like to ask you before you leave to fill out a quick survey on this event that the colleagues will post in the chat. So as we close, please would be great if you could fill out that survey. Nicholas, your final words.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. Just thinking about the fact that it is the 20th anniversary, it also makes me reflect that it's the 25th anniversary of the Human Rights Defenders Declaration. And I actually find that to be somewhat meaningful, because I'm hearing a lot of interesting comments, both about the risk people face by doing this work and the need to protect them, but also about how difficult it is still to participate meaningfully in processes such as this under the aegis of the UN and more broadly. Just reflecting what I saw in some of the chats, people asking really good questions about access to this event, to what it means to participate in this event, in particular the challenges faced by developing country and global South participants or anti-corruption activists. So I wonder if, just as a final concluding thought, it does merit making sure there is space for discussion in Atlanta about whether this multilateral process is as open and transparent and consistent with its own values as stated as it could be when it comes to civil society participation. I think it's probably ahead of many such processes, but there's definitely still work to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for everybody who attended this session today. We really hope to see many of you at the COSP in Atlanta at the Civil Society Forum the day before the COSP. Please get more information on the UNCAC Coalition website, on the host government website. I shared the links in the chat. If we, and navigating the UNCAC processes is very technical, and space for civil society is limited. So if we as the UNCAC Coalition can be of help, if you have questions, don't hesitate to email us, reach out to us, so we can help you navigate this. We really look forward to meeting many of you, working together for more civic space, for a stronger review mechanism, but also to advance key policies such as beneficial ownership transparency. We will prepare a report summarizing today's discussion, which we will disseminate to all the people who have signed up and through our website and newsletter. So we hope it will reach you. We hope you enjoyed this session and this discussion. Again, I would like to thank the speakers for their insights, for their expertise, and for all the really valuable insights from the audience. Please fill out the survey if you haven't before you leave. And thank you again for joining us today, for taking the time. I look forward to seeing many of you in person in Atlanta in December. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
From India.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you.